Greetings, everyone. From my home in sunny, walkable downtown Middletown, my research assistant Marco and I, Jeff Bianco, your classmate, hopes to find you all safe and healthy. I'm going to be presenting World City of London, UK today, a historic leader and continuing innovator in sustainable transit. The presentation is separated into three parts today. The first, underlying factors and history of the development of the city and its dominant modes of transit. The second, story of the TfL, the Transport for London, the city's transit agency, and its role in planning and governance, particularly of transit. And the final section will be a review of how London meets Jarrett Walker's 7 demands of good transit. The three sections are graphically tied to the colors of the three earliest tube lines, help you navigate the presentation and skip the sections as you wish. That's Marco saying, all aboard the Metropolitan line, London's oldest and the world's first underground railway. Our first stop is 500 miles away in Switzerland, where 93 million years ago, the same tectonic forces that are forming the Alps tear a chunk, a triangular wedge, out of the southeast corner of Great Britain. 40 million years of sedimentary deposit creates the London Basin on which the city is built. Interestingly, the modern Transport for London map on the right-hand side shows how the underlying geology is mirrored in the current city. Development is concentrated north of the Thames River, where the city is built on top of the London clay, and is much sparser south of the river, where a layer of sandy soils overlays the clay and becomes waterlogged. Our next stop is the founding of Londinium by the Romans in 43 AD at the easternmost point of the Thames so that they could bridge and still have shipping. Londinium grew into a city of 50,000 people, the leading city of Britannia. And while the Roman grid is long since gone, the outer walls still define the edges of the city, the financial district of London, and London Bridge has remained in the same location for 2,000 years. We now take an express jump ahead in time to begin our look at the various modes of transit in London. While the average Londoner follows the Marchetti constant and travels 1 hour per day, they use a variety of modes to get there, as can be seen in this chart by TfL of transit usage in the past 50 years. Single-occupant cars in blue, along with multi-passenger cars in gray, make up 60% of the traffic. In red and yellow at the bottom of the chart, rail and subways carry the next most. And in bright red at the top, buses carry essentially the rest. We'll also be looking at the lesser contributions from ferries, trams, pedestrians, cyclists, and the impact of airports on the city as well. In the 2,000 years since the Romans built the original, London Bridge has been the nexus of roadway systems on the island of Great Britain. In a sense, London is only secondarily a port on the River Thames. London's organic branching geometry of streets is a holdover from its unplanned medieval development patterns, and this largely contributes to the current traffic congestion and complexity of transport modes in the city today. When this map was drawn early in Queen Elizabeth I's reign, horse-drawn wheeled vehicles were able to get about the city of 200,000 at about the pace of 8 miles per hour, the same pace that pre-pandemic congested traffic could achieve. Following the Great London Fire of 1666, Sir Christopher Wren famously proposed a new city plan on the blank slate that would have regularized the street grid for the first time since 5th century Londinium. Land ownership rights, entropy, and expediency conspired to prevent this from happening, and London continued to grow as a tangled web into modern times. In the 1960s, highway advocates proposed a series of concentric ring roads to regularize and speed up traffic. Thankfully, that failed, as we all know how that would have worked out. They did complete one 3-mile section of the outermost ring, and London's Westway, seen in the lower right, is the only section of London that looks like that. Instead, the typical London street looks like this. It may be congested with traffic, but the automobiles are forced to coexist with other modes of transit and with city life in general. The next stop on the Metropolitan line is probably the highlight of our trip, and that is the Metropolitan line itself, where London was first in the world and continues to be an innovative leader in sustainable transit. Before they invented the Underground Railroad, however, the English had already excelled in railroads themselves. And the first that arrived in the city, at London Bridge, of course, in 1836, that original terminal, shown in the image on the left, was soon joined by 5 other terminals that surround the central business district and 12 other station stops within the city. The National Rail essentially provides commuter rail service within the city for the cost of subway fare itself, and then in addition, of course, allows continued rides on through the rest of England. In 1863, the Metropolitan Underground Railway opened. It continues to this day as an integral part of the London Underground system. That original 3¾ mile line was the world's first subway, and its 7 stations, 3 of which connected to railroad termini, served 9.5 million riders its first year. This level of service was quite impressive. There were 4 trains per hour off peak and 6 trains per hour during the morning rush, and it only reduced to 3 trains per hour after 8 p.m. It was built with the cut and cover method, as you can see in the illustration on the right, which is highly disturbing as the entire street is opened up to build the tunnel and left open until they complete it and then covered back over again. London was already the world's largest city when the railroads first arrived in 1836. It was nearly 2 million people. And when the subway first arrived, there were already over 3 million people. By the time the system was electrified in 1908, this dense underground network was serving a metropolis of over 7 million people. Electrification also enabled the development of the deep tunnel lines of the system. Here's where the underlying geology comes into play again. The dense London clay allows for the boring of inherently waterproof tunnels with minimal structural reinforcement required during construction. At depths of 10 stories and more below the surface, they consequently have little to no impact on the activities of the city above. This confirms why the map of London looks the way it does. The tubes follow the dense London clay, and dense development follows the tube. The early 20th century generated the classic mental images that my generation carries of the system. Incandescent lit round-top subway cars, and most iconically of all, of course, Londoners sheltering in the underground during the Blitz. The modern tube continues to be a visual icon of London. The long escalator rides necessitated by the deep tubes are themselves a frequent plot device. It seems every BBC or British movie detective or MI5 agent needs to chase at least one crim or spy through the crowds of the moving stairs. That's Javier Bardem eluding James Bond in a recent 007 in the lower right. The bulk of tube stations look like this, with a single platform per direction and connecting tunnels to the other direction and stairs or escalators connecting to transfers. Platform-level electronic signs announce train schedules, which vary in headway throughout the day in sections of the system. Current peak service on the oldest lines are 28 trains per hour. The tube basically runs from 5:30 a.m. to midnight, with service balanced toward a spread-out peak focus. TfL at times actually uses signage as a subterfuge at busy transfer points to waylay riders so that dangerous bottlenecks don't overcome the stairs and tunnel connections. Maintenance and modernization of existing stations results in the same format, but with upgraded finishes and amenities, for example, Wi-Fi and improved lighting. While the newest and particularly higher profile stations look like full railroad airport concourses, and the future lines all will have a new uniform train look as below on the right. While bus service is a direct continuation of 19th century horse-drawn omnibus lines, its widespread mass transit use really dates from the 1950s when the ubiquitous AEC Routemaster classic red double-decker buses supplanted the similar-looking and similarly routed double-decker electrified trolley lines. While the tube emphasizes ridership focus, the buses provide coverage service of the entire city with over 19,000 stops throughout Greater London. The vast extent and complexity of the network requires that the TfL produces hundreds of partial maps, spider maps as they call them, just of individual route lines and neighborhoods. The bus on the lower right is shown in a newspaper image demonstrating that the front doors of current buses are closed to riders in response to the pandemic. TfL has installed plastic air barrier shields on the interior of the buses to protect the drivers because they're deemed essential workers as they're providing the bulk of travel access for medical workers. In 1860, London had its first horse-drawn tram service and was operated by this American on the lower right, George Francis Train, who was ultimately arrested for breaking the streets because he just went ahead and laid the tracks on top of the pavement without getting any authorization to do so. The service, though, was very popular, and Parliament stepped in to straighten it out and worked out a law that the tops of the rails had to be level with the road surface, and tram operators were required to maintain the disturbed roadways. The service really took off, and London developed one of the most extensive, well-used, and long-lived tram services. All of the city, as you can see in the map here, was basically covered with the exception of a donut, a double donut kind of in the center, where the tops of Kensington and Belgravia didn't want the riffraff to come and rattle their teacups, so no trams there. There even was a north-south tram tunnel that expressed service through part of town. Londoners ultimately had their own Robert Moses. His name was Ernest Marbles, whose family owned a tarmac business, and he oversaw the dismantling of the system. The double-decker on the left is signed last tram week, signaling the end of service for London. And for 50 years, Londoners had no trolleys or tram service. Till 2000, when TfL reinstituted a line based more of a light rail line in the southern suburb of Croydon. And the bright green livery obviously indicates that trams are much more ecological than the red buses. Despite London's own John Starley having invented the modern bicycle, London has never been a great or very safe cycling city. 20 years ago, the city started trying out painted and signed bike routes on otherwise unchanged streets, but with abrupt discontinuities in the path and parked cars ignoring the use of the lanes. This was frightening as hell and resulted in a number of actual cycling fatalities. About 10 years ago, they started to create some dedicated isolated bike lanes, and that is shown in this graph here where it looks like there's been a tremendous increase in cycling traffic, though in reality they were starting from zero. The image on the left is actually from a 60s era government film promoting cycling. Unfortunately, that poor rider died in traffic at the next turn. The bewildered gent on the right is wondering what happens to the cyclists when they crash into the back of the cars parked into the abrupt end of their cycling lane. Still, cycling is not an end-mile necessity in London, where transit coverage is nearly universal. Rather, it's an alternative to transit itself. It supplants tube riders rather than car drivers. And bikes are allowed on the tube only before 7:30 in the morning and weekends and holidays, never on buses. Ferries are called river buses and run east and west along the Thames, alternating stops on the north and south banks. The maps indicate mode transfers available at each stop. Unfortunately, the service is highly polluting as the vessels are exempt from London's extremely strict emissions controls. Londoners call the sidewalks the pavement. The aesthetics of walking on these sidewalks is greatly enhanced by that famous pavement itself, which are kind of the Goldilocks of paving stones. Not too big, not too little like bricks, just right, and able to be maintained by a single worker at a time. London's status as an international center for finance, business, and culture depends on its jet connections to the rest of the world. 6 airports encircle the city, all former RAF facilities, and reflect the difficulties of mixing airports into dense urban centers. Heathrow is the main port and intercontinental gateway, while Gatwick handles continental traffic. The others are smaller and anticipate growth that the others won't be able to absorb. while direct tube connections are enhancing the service overall. Mind the gap as we now transfer to the Central Line and begin our look at planning and governance. The Greater London Authority, headed by Mayor Khan, governs the overall amalgamation of 2 cities and 30 boroughs. It's a very large city. It's always been larger than New York City, in fact, but it is relatively low-rise and less dense. Essentially, London's as if Brooklyn was expanded to 10 times its size, but at half its density. The outer boroughs look suburban, in fact, downright bucolic, as these images show. This is the final impact of London clay, as it's extremely expensive to build foundations for buildings over 4 stories tall. The urban growth boundary of 1955 is under pressure for residential development, as seen in this image, since much of the green area is within a 10-minute walk of a transit stop. Founded in the year 2000, TfL, or Transport for London, has since covered all transportation within Greater London: sidewalks, bridges, tunnels, public-private transit, waterways, shoe wheels, I don't know. The principal transit goal of their Plan 2050 is to foster London's continued growth. Interestingly, they have focused on the employment destination side of the daily commute, believing that encouraging increased job density in the center will maintain their competitiveness with other world financial centers. They anticipate needing up to 50,000 new housing units per year, but prefer to allow residential growth to occur where the market allows. The current TfL business plan projects to 2031, and its primary infrastructure investment is to complete Crossrail, the new 73-mile national rail commuter line across North London, which will widely expand the east-west reach of a half-hour commute. In planning since 1948, the underground section within the city is named the Elizabeth Line, although construction is currently on virus hold. While the tube represents London's transit apex and cycling their nadir, continued incremental upgrades stand as their greatest achievement, particularly at the scale they operate in. Some of the current projects include this new car on the left, part of the 4-line modernization project. The 4 oldest lines will be automated, increasing service from 28 to 32 trains per hour. Along with their new higher capacity cars and wider doors, peak capacities should increase by 30%. They're trying electric and fuel cell buses, as seen here. They're adding Wi-Fi to all stations. And finally, they're testing a limited on-demand service in coverage areas, in other words, Uber buses. TfL strives to provide equitable service for all, studying their relationship with riders based on age, gender, economic status, physical impairment, and race. They offer carrot inducements in a quirky British way, like the "allow me a seat" button, and they look into the esoteric minutiae of subgroup interests. They know that 16% of the disabled would ride bikes on occasion versus 18% of able-bodied. Wow. I don't know if you noticed that on the earlier pavement slide, there was no change in the appreciation of 65-year-olds for the pavement between 2018 and 2017. They are bureaucrats, but they are trying. They aren't afraid either of using the stick. Surcharges for driving in the congestion charge area are $15 a day, and an additional $15 a day for high-emission vehicles, in other words, anything less than a hybrid. The TfL's web presence is also very laudable. Trip planning or pricing, employment opportunities, project news, and maps. They even have this weekend drinking partying map of the tube night service that interfaces with late-night taxi stands. And they have aggressively published the stay-at-home message. Overall, London traffic is down 90%. We, however, are still traveling, so mind the gap as we transfer to our final leg on the Circle Line. And here, London meets all 7 demands of good transit. It provides transit coverage for the entire city with strong peak service and 24-hour coverage service, with a transfer network system allowing for expeditious travel at reasonable fares, safely and with British charm. With redundancy of modes, it's reliable and flexible. This geographically accurate map, not the diagrammatic one, shows how the region is entirely covered. TfL uses Oyster cards as its payment system. Seniors, young kids, and many disabled groups ride for free. They have a fair but complicated pricing on the dominant high ridership underground and flat fares on the universal coverage buses. Tube fares are complex with 6 zones and peak off-peak costs. It's best to use the online calculator if you're counting pennies. Not even every station has readers that will recalculate your balance. And while you could pay $6 in cash for the most expensive one-way ride, it's only $3 with the prepaid Oyster card. Buses cost a flat $175 per ride, with a maximum of $5 and a quarter per day. Cards only, no cash taken. The aesthetic respect that London shows the riding public carries to the level of its world-famous graphics. By the way, in addition to using their colors for this show, I've used Gil Sand's typeface, the commercial version of London Underground typeface specially created for them in 1916. Finally, I'll leave it to the man himself. According to Walker's website, the dominant mode in a region is determined by which one meets most of the 7 demands. And in quote, I say, in the core areas of Paris, London, and New York, these demands explain why rapid transit, not the automobile, is dominant. Well, we've reached the end of the line. Mind the gap as you exit. Lastly, I will attach a separate Caboose page of links to some amusing British Transit YouTubes and bid you farewell with Londoner Petula Clark's transit advice. Somewhere else to go. Don't sleep in the subway, darling. Don't stand in the pouring rain. Don't sleep in the subway, darling. The night is long. Forget your foolish pride, nothing's wrong. Now you're beside me again. Don't sleep in the subway, darling. Don't stand